Welcome back, everyone, or welcome here for some of you. My name is Charlotte von Robert, and the honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker comes to me as the outgoing director of the Taube Center of Jewish Studies here at Stanford, along with also trying to direct the program in feminist gender and sexuality studies at the moment. And much as the merit of organizing this conference at the tail end, hopefully, of the pandemic months and years goes to other people. My gratitude goes in the first instance to my friend and colleague, Professor Amir Eshel, the Edward Clark Crosset Professor of Humanistic Studies and Professor of Comparative Literature. I always have to look up all the chairs' names. Who together with the wonderful Courtney Hodrick convened this gathering, not only because Amir teaches Hannah Arendt regularly, but as you know, is charged with editing the volumes on Arendt's Jewish writings for the Surkamp edition of her work. It is therefore my great honor and delight to welcome to our conference on Hannah Arendt Professor Judith Butler, who among numerous other titles and positions is the Hannah Arendt Chair and Professor of Philosophy at the European Graduate School, the EGS, who generously agreed to address this group of intellectuals and scholars from around the country and very locally. And I'm hoping that since your home institution, where you hold the Maxine Elliott Professorship in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory on the left banks of the Bay, you're coming here tonight from there, not from wherever else in the world, and not from Switzerland, where the EGS is, I found out. So, of course, Judith Butler is someone who does not really need any introduction at all, almost to anyone, and certainly not to anyone here. Most of us read their work, draw on and argue with their work for our own work, teach their work, and try to teach them, or should emphasize, try to teach their work. And I should probably say aspects of their work, at least speaking for myself, for Judith's work is so wide-ranging that many of us get immersed in one corner and remain afloat at best in the other corners. But now, as it sounds, this deserves an emphasis, much as Judith's work gets identified as gender and queer theory. And speaking for myself again, and guilty as charged, I keep returning to Gender Trouble and its monumental intervention in feminist theory and politics as the book that you have to have read and thought through as a graduate student in the humanities, together with Bodies That Matter, and later still Undoing Gender, and so on. As the most influential book with its anniversary editions, the one that shook existing intellectual fields and started new ones. Admitting my own shortcoming and the reductiveness of declaring Judith's work Judith as the most important gender theorist of gender and sex theory and queer theory, I'm all in favor of thinking of that book as the overture to the immense body of work that followed, in the sense of anticipating the themes and commitments to what was to follow. I'm not going to recite the long list of titles that follow Gender Trouble. Speaking as a scholar of Talmudic literature, allow me instead to draw on a metaphor familiar in that world. The sea of the Talmud, the Yam HaTalmud. So Judith, your work has a Talmudic range, and in terms of discourse, your books and essays resonate with the sharpest theoretical analyses of that corpus, much as the discussions and debates of the sages of late antiquity map a cosmos of intellectual passion and rigor, so does your work, as you pursue the passion and commitments of the life of the mind through always innovative and critical readings of a wide range of texts in philosophy, psychoanalysis, and literature, from Irigaray, Freud, Antigone, Arendt, and so on, all in ways that are completely awe-inspiring. The threads that move through the work are through the Talmud Butler, are thinking the intellectual and political conditions of domination and marginalization, of power and violence, of the machinations of identity making and the concomitant mechanisms of exclusion. And through it all, it is always a radical commitment to making thinking troubling and troubling thinking, much as we are all haunted by the degradation of thinking in the 20th century that went and continues to go hand in hand with the destruction of entire populations. And we talked a little about this morning. Beyond that, Judith Butler is also known for their critical voice in socio-political discourse and debate. I'm not going to mention the works here. I always want to point at all the things that we should know and hopefully will get to read. So you have never been merely a remote philosopher or critical theorist whose lofty pronouncements, those of us plowing in the fields of mere intellectual expertise, are left to decode. You have opened yourself and have remained open to what is at stake in the present, and in your passionate engagement in conversations with contemporaries in and outside the academy. In fact, inside and outside the academy is not even a meaningful juxtaposition when it comes to your ethical and political commitments. And in this, as in so many other ways, you remain and are in conversation with the intellectual style of Hannah Arendt, the subject of this gathering, who equally threw herself into the battlegrounds of political thinking in general and Jewish politics in particular. I want to conclude my brief introduction with citing what you wrote about Arendt's Eichmann book on the occasion of the 50th anniversary. I think now we are the 61st year, right, of the trial, because I see in it a reflection of your own intellectual state. So I want to say we can replace Butler with Arendt. But so Professor Butler wrote, if Arendt thought existing notions of legal intention in national criminal courts were inadequate to the task of grasping and adjudicating Nazi crimes, it was also because she thought that Nazism performed an assault against thinking. Her view at once aggrandized the place and role of philosophy in the adjudication of genocide and called for a new mode of political and legal reflection that she, Arendt, believed would safeguard both thinking and the rights of an open and a plural global population to protection against destruction, quote end. It's so weird to channel your voice. But surely very few others in this generation have continued to make the case for the task and challenge of true thinking. Please help me to welcome Professor Judith Butler.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. I'd like to thank all the organizers and Amir in particular, who took me aside and told me everything would be okay. I've already learned so much today, and I realize that I read Hannah Arendt often and put her on my class. I'm giving a class on Hannah Arendt next semester, but I'm not an expert, and but I am surrounded today by true scholars, and I'm moved and amazed by that. Take this as the reflections of a passionate amateur. I'd like to talk to you today about Hannah Arendt and Kafka. She writes on Kafka on different occasions, but perhaps the most extended consideration takes place in her preface to between past and future. In some important philosophical sense, she's seeking to understand there the interval between past and future, one that we tend to call the present. But if this present is an interval of some kind, it's not quite a discrete phenomenon that we can locate. It is rather what she will call a gap, a break in linear time, but also a departure from spatial coherence. It may seem, on first glance, vitalistic or immediate, this notion that the present is a gap in time, but that's not Arendt's way. Her formulation challenges us to consider what we are doing when, for instance, we diagnose the political present or ask what the history of the present may be. We expect that present to be available to us, that we can track or reconstruct the way that the present emerges from the past. For Arendt, the problem of the present, or the challenge of thinking the present as an interval, emerges through and with the question, what can be transmitted from the past? Indeed, at the outset of the essay, she asks how a tradition or inheritance can be passed on or received if it does not take written form, if it is not distilled in a communicable form. Under such conditions, can there be a testament to what has happened? The question she considers is formulated by René Char, who is referring to the French resistance when he remarks, "Notre héritage n'est précédé d'aucun testament," or as Arendt translates, our inheritance was left to us by no testament. A more literal translation would be, our inheritance, or even patrimony, is preceded by no testament. One thing does not come before the other, suggesting that linear time cannot convey how transmission happens. In other words, if that heritage, if that inheritance or patrimony, héritage, if it arrives for us, it does so not by way of a testament and not by way of what precedes its arrival, but in some other way. Why should this be the case, and what does it mean? Now, if there were a testament, it would be some kind of tangible proof of events that have happened, perhaps even a certification, or a will that makes clear that it was someone's expressed desire that we come into property of a certain kind of historical understanding. But the past does not come down to us that way, that is, through established patrimonial ties or court orders. So if it does arrive in some form, it does so by a passage to the side of those established legal mechanisms. No authority guarantees that transmissibility or certifies what is delivered. And this will have repercussions for Arendt's reading of Kafka, which, by the way, is our theme for today, this evening. And for Kafka, as we know, the very transmissibility of law is questioned time and again. But here, Arendt is engaging a debate about historical time, even though, as we will see, there is also a religious problem which has to do with the transmissibility of the law, or rather the authority of the law, and with understanding the importance for her of that break in and from that line of transmission. When Char poses that question in 1943, he is in the middle of the resistance, but also at the same time, at the very same time, recognizing the transient character of what he is living through. Following Char, Arendt understands that this concerted action, the resistance movement, is a promising and transient moment of solidarity. She reflects on Char's phrase in the years after liberation, so from beyond this break in history, in patrimony, in testamentary time, reflecting on that break as the chance for a mutual form of promising that emerges from the plurality, or rather between its members, as they craft the laws by which they now want to live. This plurality, this post-war plurality, is a political community or form of belonging, open-ended and in a dynamic state of formation, reflecting on the political actions of the people who, suddenly freed of officialdom, freed of fascism, freed of Vichy, come together to decide the form of their political world, what kind of form they give to their common lives. Of course, that all sounds idealistic, since in fact people who emerge from histories of revolutionary overthrow are still burdened by history, often traumatic history. And so it seems as if Arendt is engaging in a highly speculative fashion. Revolutions are always conditioned, as are their aftermaths. And yet, no account of those conditions can account for the form of freedom that sustains resistance or surges up into revolution. Although we do, in an historical mode, reconstruct such events, and we're surely right to do so, something about that break cannot be explained through schemas that rely on linear time. Now, if the transition between past and future is understood as an interval or even a gap, something else is at stake. In a way that recalls Rosa Luxemburg's understanding of the kind of spontaneity that emerges in the general strike, understood as unanticipated revolutionary potential, Arendt also seeks recourse to an idea of freedom that is bound up with concerted action on the one hand and judgment on the other. Char seems to tell us that for this most important moment, a moment in which we find ourselves in an uprising, in general strike, even in revolution, there can be no testament. Worse, after certain forms of overthrow, politics itself can become forsaken as the people return to their bourgeois private lives. They were engaged in concerted action to throw off an illegitimate authority, but then once successful, they lost that solidarity. Or so Arendt recasts Char's strangely anticipatory form of melancholia. This event, which I am part of, will one day be lost, and there will be no trace, at least no trace, of what we may call upsurge, interval, or break. Arendt concurs to the degree that the end of the French resistance and the vanquishing of fascism, for the moment, saw many combatants return to private affairs or to sectarian struggles over who should hold power and at the expense of whom. In the aftermath of resistance, a certain sadness ensues, and whether or not it is fully conscious, there is a mourning on the part of those whose entitlements have been restored in the years after the years of resistance, for the treasure that apparently was those years. The time of which Arendt writes has no testament, and yet here is Arendt writing, giving some kind of testament to the time ex post facto. She is aware, however, that she has already lost the moment for which she seeks to give an account, and that is her topic. Is she answering Char's call, or is part of the value of the event precisely that it was without documents, if not undocumentable, consisting rather as an upsurge of bodily speech and word, a more or less unqualified upsurge of freedom? In Arendt's terms, those who took part in the resistance had become challengers and, I quote, had begun to create that public sphere between themselves where freedom could appear, end quote. Note that Arendt's idea of freedom is precisely not personal liberty or the prerogative of individuals. One of her worries in this text is that the idea of an inner freedom, which for her is a non-political freedom, has predisposed philosophical thinking about freedom in some seriously errant ways. So she is clear about what freedom is not. It is not an attribute of thought or a quality of the will. And when she first starts to tell us about what it is, that is to say, in her essay on freedom, she refers to the free man's status, understood first as the freedom to move and the freedom to gather. So freedom first becomes clear in the context in which constraints are thrown off, freedom, thus, as the absence of constraint. But freedom is also the condition in which the ability to act in public first becomes possible. The constraints thrown off might be the private sphere, the prison or slavery. But for freedom to be true freedom, there must be a common public sphere or space, as she puts it. That is not to say that all forms of common space are free or give rise to freedom. It's only to say that where freedom exists, it exists in such a space, it brings about the space of appearance. An action cannot be determined, she tells us, by motives or external effects. and action can only take place in a common public space. She considers the view that freedom may be a principle, one that exists outside the human and is instantiated through human action. But she rejects that view, for a free action cannot simply embody the principle communicated by an ethical demand. On the contrary, and this formulation is important, and I quote, "The inspiring principle becomes fully manifest only in the performing act itself," end quote. Or again, another of her formulations, "The appearance of freedom, like the manifestation of principles, coincides with the performing act," end quote. You didn't know Hannah Arendt has a theory of performativity, but she does. Bonnie Honig has made it clear. In any case, in other words, the principle cannot be known in advance of its exercise, and yet freedom is not simply the punctual manifestation of a principle belonging only to that moment and nothing more. No, freedom is, in her words, inexhaustible, open to an infinite iteration. It is certainly not that individuals are endowed with an inexhaustible faculty or capacity. No, anyone who's been involved in a freedom struggle of one kind or another knows what exhaustion is. No, individuals are faulty and precarious, but sometimes they can and do act, especially in the context when they are acting in concert, which has a regenerative character. To grasp this reiterative inexhaustibility that is freedom, one has to understand the rhythm of transience that Schar underscored. Although Arendt's early work on Augustine clearly addressed these issues, the resonance of that early work with other Jewish influences on her work has not been often considered. Susanne Gottlieb in Regions of Sorrow, the Messianic in Arendt and Auden, has done, I think, a brilliant job of underscoring the messianic character of Arendt's views on suffering and action, noting that the messianic is a schema in which the inner potentialities of action are the only place where we can find redemption. Similarly, Martine Lebovici in Hannah Arendt et la tradition juive cautions against understanding Arendt's status as a secular writer as an accomplished reality. For Lebovici, secularization is not a straightforward process that comes to a complete and final closure. It is open-ended, bearing the traces of the religion it leaves behind, showing in effect that the past is not so easily overcome by a form of secularization understood as the progressive shedding of religious belief and commitment. Indeed, the edited book, Love and St. Augustine, derived from Arendt's dissertation, supervised by Karl Jaspers in 1929, makes no reference at all to Judaism in its endnotes. And I searched in vain only to find a query at the outset in an introduction about why a Jewish woman formed in a secular setting would find in Augustine, especially his ideas about time, caritas, and civitas, a theological topic worth engaging philosophically as intensely as she did. Doubtless there are many reasons, and one does not have to belong to a religion to study it intensely, though both Hans Jonas and Karl Jaspers did ask her that question, why this topic? For a nice Jewish girl, what's the, okay. In the Augustine book, she writes, and I quote, in the beginning of life meant our entrance into the world, and its end means that we must leave the world. The reference goes back before the world and before life in the world to what she calls the source of life. Okay, so much as the resistance knows the sorrow of its transience even at the moment in which it's lived, Hannah Arendt writes that the moment of birth is already the experience of transience. Transience arrives with all life lived in time. She writes further there, and I quote, that time is not only the index of transience, time itself is transience. And then, as if prefiguring what she will write in Between Past and Future, nearly 40 years later, She writes, and I quote, "We exist only insofar as we relate directly to the before and not yet of our existence," end quote. Now, between those two texts, and there are many decades there, Arendt encountered Benjamin, became his friend, sought to help him leave Vichy France, and ended up chronicling, as best she could, his final days, and also reflected on the problem of time, transmission, and ruin in his writings. I'm not saying she left an Augustinian perspective on time for a Benjaminian one, but I think the inflection surely changes in those intervening years. The Messianic for Benjamin also references the source of life, although always indirectly, and to the extent that the divine, in divine violence, for instance, is messianic, it functions by way of an interval or a break with the time and space of legal violence. His theological political fragment is clearly influenced by the reading of Kabbalah in his early years and his conversations with Sholem. There he argues that the Messianic cannot appear or reveal itself in history. It cannot be revealed in time, precisely because it does not belong to the temporal order presupposed by revelation. This claim is repeated in another register when Arendt insists that the central moments of both resistance and revolution are not revealed in time because they constitute a break with those very temporal orders. Rather, at least at this stage, the Messianic in Benjamin's work is described as the traversal of one temporal modality by another. The Messianic, in fact, marks the failure of anything historical to signify the divine, which is one reason why the Messiah cannot be an historical instantiation of the divine. I mean, that was Kierkegaard's question: how can the divine become historical? But that is not Benjamin's. The Messianic, already refused as a human figure, proves to be the limit and dissolution of human form. It is described rather as the recurrent and rhythmic downfall or falling away that characterizes the transience of all living things. The eternal thus traverses the transient without ever becoming transient and losing its status as the eternal. In the Theses on the Philosophy of History, or the Concept of History, written 2 decades later in 1940, it is the history of the oppressed that flashes up within present time, disrupting its temporal continuity and contesting its progressive claims. In both the political and theological registers, we are asked to understand how one time traverses another without becoming absorbed and contained in or by the time traversed. And though the focus changes in the 21-year interval between these two essays, from eternity to the history of the oppressed, both modalities are referred to as messianic, meaning a traversal or a breaking through of one time into another, producing a problem for causality and narrative alike. And this brings me to my question about Arendt. Is the Messianic operating in her work, and if so, how? The interval to which she referred gives us, I believe, a clue to understanding how a Messianic interruption or cessation works. And here again, I build upon Susanne Gottlieb's important work, Regions of Sorrow, where she shows how Arendt took up messianic notions from her interlocutors to expose the possibilities of both failure and renewal in the sphere of freedom, action, and politics. And yet Arendt turns to René Char to make her case in between past and future, marking that interval that cannot belong to any version of linear time. Indeed, the title poses the problem: what, if anything, is there between past and future? In the dissertation work on Augustine, it is our human existences that are to be found there. But as Arendt further doffs the Heideggerian influences, she comes to understand the interval as the upsurge of freedom, as well as a break with what she calls rectilinear time. When freedom emerges or appears, it's not the simple reproduction of a precedent or the instantiation of an already established model. No, freedom is defined by its unprecedented character, which is to say that it is always defined in relation to a temporal novelty. strictly speaking, it is the effect of no cause, but rather an infinitely renewable exercise, infinitely renewable not for me or for you, but only because it is not the property or expression of any individual. It emerges rather from the relation between us or among us, a relation that we would be right to call, perhaps, a covenant rather than a contract, belonging to what she called civitas. That relation is an interval, a break in the line, and we still have to understand in what way this breakup of rectilinear time relates to what is inexhaustibly free, that is unconditioned and unforeseen. And what aspect of that inexhaustibility is to be understood theologically? Arendt's turn to Kafka is an important one at this juncture. I'm struck by the way that the transience that Charles laments in the midst of the experience of resistance, which should be, I suppose, an absorption in vitality, resonates with what Benjamin says about what is eternal in transient life. Benjamin notes not only that this life is transient, but that all life is, underscoring that transience is that which recurs in this life, and all other lives are living processes. This recurrence, however, is not transient. This recurrence will never end and constitutes a reiterative version of the inexhaustible. So let us remain, if we can, with this thought. It's not an easy thought with which to remain. If the recurrent character of transience is eternal, meaning that it has neither beginning nor end, then the recurrence itself is not transience, even though no description of transience can do without it. The recurrence that characterizes transience requires a multiplicity of transient beings or processes in duration, since without that multiplicity and duration, there would be no recurrence or reiteration, and so no punctual condition for what Benjamin calls the rhythm of transience. That rhythm seems to inform and exceed all transient things, and that situation does not cease happening, or rather it would only cease with the destruction of all things transient, that is, when all transience has ceased. So as long as there is transience, there is this rhythm, although God knows we cannot always find it. Although awkward and arguably painful to find eternity in the passing of life, it strikes me as significant since it is not an afterlife that comes to console us, and though it seems to be imminent to life, it's also not the same as human time. It's the eternal feature of what continually passes. Benjamin's formulation clearly differs from the Heideggerian focus on finitude, the idea that no one can die for me, that in relation to death I am non-substitutable, a fact which illuminates my finite singularity. Benjamin suggests, rather, that my passing or the passing of others has to be understood as a recurrence, even a rhythmic one. Every instance, no matter how singular, is a recurrent moment. And in Benjamin's short piece, this theological political fragment, we are asked to understand this process of transience or downfall, Untergang, as a rhythmic recurrence, one that he also calls a form of happiness. Apparently, once we grasp the recurrent character of our own transience, it's no longer ours alone, but belongs to all living creatures, and the very recurrence becomes, in some sense, musical or rhythmic, a sense of sound that exceeds life itself, the occasion for another kind of happiness, one far removed from the kind that utilitarians have been calculating all these years. Interestingly enough, when Arendt reflects on the kind of social movements and collective action that Schar lives and mourns at the same time, she calls it public happiness. It's a form of happiness that emerges, as it were, between us, not exactly when we're tearing a structure down, but when, or maybe then, but also when we are building the world in which we want to live together, without denying the potential transience of that world. Indeed, for Arendt, as far back as the dissertation, happiness cannot be dissociated from transience. So, of course, this relation of eternal recurrence, not to be confused with Nietzsche's version, appears in Arendt's own reflections on history and freedom, for in her language, as I've said, freedom is also inexhaustible. Perhaps we can see here a departure from the axis of Heidegger-Augustin toward another one, namely Benjamin Kafka. This reiteration of the inexhaustible departs from rectilinear time. It does not realize a pre-established goal. It is a process of making or coming into being. And as we shall soon see, I hope, it also informs her relation to law, establishing her position in a strangely proximate relation to anarchism, or rather an interesting amalgam of federalism on the one hand and anarchism on the other. I realize that many of you may not know these texts, so I'm teaching at the same time that I'm trying to build an argument. I've begun, see, now we reiterate, I've begun by pointing out two instances of the interval. One is the interval of freedom or of free resistance, an unauthorized upsurge against an established authority or its constraints. Nothing authorizes the break with authority, and in this sense, the break is a break with established forms of authorization. The interval, however, also appears as a feature of plurality, designating the relation or opening between persons from which concerted action emerges, free and concerted action. Here, the interval is precisely the non-foundational source of freedom, its reiterated origination, but also that form of concerted action that is resistance, and that form of deliberate action on the part of a plurality through which a new polity comes into being. For Arendt, the action through which new politics are formed cannot be violent, even though revolutionary action can be accompanied by violence. Indirectly arguing against Benjamin, who thought that all lawmaking is a form of violence, what he called mythic violence, Arendt claims that power is distinct from violence, and that power characterizes, Macht, rather than Gewalt, characterizes the collaborative and plural action of bringing a new political reality into the world, an action that she claims belongs to a broader principle of natality. Power is thus distinct from violence, and violence can never be creative, or so she argues in her counter-Benjaminian essay on violence. I would say that at least a third of that essay is an objection to Benjamin without ever mentioning him. He was, after all, her friend. In any case, if several people act freely in the Arendtian sense, they no longer act from conscience, but rather from their bond with one another, a bond that is known by its effects, but cannot itself be documented as an historical fact. Acting together, they have not become an undifferentiated mass, but rather a differentiated collective. If several people act as disobedience, as civil disobedience, then none of them are precisely acting from their individuality. Whatever else civil disobedience are doing, they are taking issue with the social form of individualism. They're refusing heroism, and in this way, they're refusing both a masculinist form of individuality and a moral narcissism that too often goes under the name of political action. There are ways of reading her that expose the risks of military heroism and its masculinization right now. She herself probably would not have done that, but we surely can. What she does offer, however, is an account of freedom that challenges both classical liberal forms of individualism and collective notions of the mass that deny all singularity. Well, what does this have to do with the interval? Well, this notion of the interval, the break with historical continuity, the relation among people as they engage freely in concerted action, this seems to be a transient moment, one that eludes capture. It cannot be commodified or exchanged. There's no testament. She calls it public happiness, and in some ways, perhaps, this happiness constitutes the release from individualism without the denial of singularity. This would seem to be Adriana Cavallero's point in her excellent book on Arendt, Surging Democracy. Can such a moment or interval have a name? Can it receive a testament? Well, for Arendt, what has happened can be neither archived nor transmitted in that way. In this sense, there seems to be neither past nor future, only what is called, and here's a quote, sempiternal, never ending, the sempiternal change of the world and the biological cycle of living creatures within it. Now, it may seem odd to find remnants of theology in the midst of a political philosopher's reflections on time and freedom, on civil disobedience, resistance, and revolution. But that may be because we misunderstand the partial character of secularization and how a ruin can flash up in a new form, organizing new concepts. It turns out that to understand this interval, Kafka is helpful, if not necessary. So Arendt turns her attention there. But with that turn to one of his parables comes Benjamin's understanding of parable and its relation to Talmudic interpretation. That's for you, Charlotte. In the last part of this talk, I will try to explain and then briefly relate all this back to the political forms that Arendt seeks to affirm. In her 1968 introduction to the Schocken collection Illuminations, she writes the following about Benjamin's generation of critics, and I quote, "They looked upon the dawn of a new age basically as a decline and viewed history along with the traditions which led up to this decline as a field of ruins. No one has expressed this more clearly than Benjamin in his Theses on the Philosophy of History, and nowhere has he said it more unequivocally than in a letter from Paris dated 1935. And here is the citation from that letter. "Actually, I hardly feel constrained to try to make head or tail of this condition of the world. On this planet, a great number of civilizations have perished in blood and horror. Naturally, one must wish for the planet that one day it will experience a civilization that has abandoned blood and horror. In fact, I am inclined to assume that our planet is waiting for this. But it is terribly doubtful whether we can bring such a present to its 100 or 400 millionth birthday party. And if we don't, the planet will finally punish us, its unthoughtful well-wishers, by presenting us with the last judgment." End quote. And again, from the same introduction, Arendt writes, "Insofar as the past has been transmitted, as tradition, it possesses authority. Insofar as authority presents itself historically, it becomes tradition. Walter Benjamin knew that the break in tradition and the loss of authority which occurred in his lifetime were irreparable, and he concluded that he had to discover new ways of dealing with the past. In this, he became a master when he discovered that the transmissibility of the past had been replaced by its citability." So from citation, citability, C-I-T-A. And that in place of its authority there had arisen a strange power to settle down piecemeal in the present and to deprive it of peace of mind, the mindless peace of complacency. And then she quotes Benjamin. "Quotations in my work are like robbers by the roadside who make an armed attack and relieve an idler of his convictions." End quote. Benjamin puts it this way when he describes Kafka's writings as citational. I quote, "He divests the human gesture of its traditional supports, and then he has a subject for reflection without end." End quote. "We pray, we declare laws and truths, but in doing so, we are seeking to recover a time that has already slipped away. The citations gesture towards something both real and lost." Further, for Benjamin, Kafka's prose pieces are not quite parables, he tells us, but they want to be taken on face value. They lend themselves to quotation and can be told for purposes of clarification. And yet the doctrine that the parables are meant to interpret, that doctrine does not exist. So what are we left with? We're left with an absent law. And the parable no longer serves the function of showing us how to live in accord with that law. The law has become lost or never existed, the authoritative law, but in relation to which a number of parables and interpretations have emerged. In Kafka, at least, they become parables about the absence of the law, and legal fiction emerges as a nearly dominant genre, nearly obsessional. In Benjamin's essay, What is Epic Theater?, the interval emerges again as the interruption that we find in Brechtian plays, the destruction of Aristotelian requirements, that events proceed according to rules of likelihood and probability. Benjamin writes that in Brecht, interruption goes beyond the sphere of art. It is one of the fundamental devices of all structuring and serves as the basis of all quotation. The interruption of context is meant to bring a bourgeois world into relief, which would otherwise continue to replicate itself more or less mindlessly in the service of a questionable ideal of progress. Now, Arendt regards this interruption of presumptive forward time as crucial for understanding what freedom is and does. It interrupts, it breaks, and it makes. What I'm calling upsurge or surging, following Adriana Cavarero, breaks open linear time, the reproduction of the bourgeois ordinary, with promise and sorrow at once. It is a predicament, one that Arendt believes that Kafka has approached in his parables. She tells us about one of those parables that is, at least in English, called He. I think it's actually without a title in German. It is about the past and the future as forces, two dueling forces acting upon a single character. This character is pressed from behind and blocked from the road ahead. He's not only blocked from behind, but from the origin, which suggests that he has always been blocked, or that the origin has always been blocked from him. The second blocks the road ahead, which means either that the man cannot go there, or that the road itself preemptively ends. The character, he, battles one way and then the other, and one of those forces supports him against the other. He's pushed forward and driven back. He seems to have no center or gravity, no way of holding still or firm. And then an odd statement is appended to the description. This is only theoretically so. As if to explain what is meant by this recourse to theory, Kafka writes that there's a third person in the scene, the man himself, and who really knows his intentions. And though we cannot know those intentions, Kafka proceeds with some confidence to tell us what he dreams, perhaps because that way we learn something of his wish. His dream, though, and I quote, is that sometime in an unguarded moment, and this would require a night darker than any night has ever yet been, he will jump out of the fighting line and be promoted on account of his experience in fighting to the position of umpire over his antagonists in their fight with one another, right? So the past is fighting, pushing, the future is pushing, they're pulling. Whoever this person is dreaming that he could jump outside this particular line in which he finds himself. This is, of course, an impossible time that's been imported into the parable. The unguarded moment is one that would require a night darker than any night has ever been. So this darkness does not belong to the darkness of nights that any of us have known, or that are in fact knowable. In another parable called The Coming of the Messiah, Kafka refers to the last day, which is not the last day of any calendar, but the very last day, the allerletzte, suggesting the day, as it were, in which calendrical time comes to a halt. Similarly, perhaps, this night here, which is being dreamt, which is being figured within the parable, belongs to another order of darkness, one which would permit the man in the middle to dream that he steps or leaps out of line. The line is a strange figure, since, of course, there is a line of three bodies, man being pushed from behind, man being blocked from ahead, and this man who's in the middle, pushed and blocked from two directions, wants to emerge out of this situation, be something other than someone who is pushed by history or drawn by the future. It's a strange kind of line and lineage, maybe a patrimony or a patrilineality, maybe a lineup of another order, I'm not sure. But if the dream of the man in the middle, who is in some sense representing the present between past and future, is to jump out of line, then the dream is precisely to leave this particular lineage, to exit this tradition or rectilinear time. That middle man with the dream wishes that someone with authority would recognize the man's experience in fighting and make him into an arbiter, an umpire, a judge. But there is no authorizing power to be found. There is only a dream of breaking the line of this bellicose impasse to enter into an adjudicative role, a position of deliberation and power, to become a judge, one who can and will exercise judgment. All this is but a dream, one that the narrative voice claims is the man's dream. Arendt comments that if the mind cannot induce reconciliation, it finds itself engaged in warfare. Does this man wish to reconcile the warring partners? Does their struggle continue without the man in the middle? These are all open questions, unknowable. But let's remember that in conflict here are past and future, and the site of an impossible arbitration is the present. In Kafka's parable, there is no progress exactly, and yet there is a dream that judgment might be possible. There's a dream that someone might authorize him to judge, and yet judgment must take place in such a circumstance without precedent, without authorization. The human figure is something of an interval in this back and forth. That man is dreaming of breaking free. And in Kafka, it does not look like that's going to happen. He can only do it in the dream. But for Hannah Arendt, I think she does think it can happen. She wants to draw our attention to those intervals that seem to be evanescent or even impossible. They carry something of eternal duration in them. The messianic will certainly not be Arendt's preferred language, but something of the eternal, understood as biological cycles, seems to be important here, an ever-generative source of life, as an intrinsic dimension of a freedom that breaks with the temporal order in order to bring something new into being. For Arendt, Kafka produces what she called a thought landscape or a thought event. If it is the past and future that clash at the sight of this man, and if this man can only hold ground by fighting them both, well, then something about that man's continuing present keeps the two forces from destroying each other. We do not know whether if the man were really to jump out of line, the fight would continue. We can ask that question of life, but not so easily of the parable. Arendt makes clear that time here is not a continuum, and in this way she nears Benjamin's view. The ground of man is precisely the interval between past and future. His standpoint is not the present, but rather a gap in time. And this gap, fleeting and eternal, is also, I think, the moment in which judgment emerges. Judgment not as something that relies on authorization or even a prior model of judgment, but as an upsurge, as part of what we might understand as free thought, unconditioned thought. Yet, even here, she seeks recourse to Augustine, who argues that once the finite human enters time, time articulates as tenses, as past and future. This man, as she calls it, has given birth to the past and future by which he is besieged and with which he is embattled. That's not a situation that the human is in, but rather the temporal definition of what the human is. And without this human creature, in fact, there would not be the past or the future and no fight between them. So this is an anthropocentric vision that she has, but one that gathers up the animals once we turn to Kafka. Arendt seems to think that the escape that the man dreams of is a traditional escape into metaphysical thought, that the man's dream is first of all a dream of a stable hierarchy and authority who could put the man in charge, make him the umpire, attribute to him a position adjudicative and legitimate. There is someone finally who can judge and order the situation, and it will be me. But something else happens here, for we're talking about a dream and a parable and in some ways offering an account of their significance. The two forces, pull and push the human figure, are infinite. They only reach the end of their respective temporal series at the moment in which they clash. They meet or clash at a diagonal, meaning that the collision is not head-on. There's a body in the way that redirects the encounter and absorbs its force. This idea of eternal change, of inexhaustible and reiterative duration, appears precisely here at the interval between past and future. She writes, "The enormous ever-changing time-space, which is created and limited by the forces of past and future. He would have found the place in time which is sufficiently removed from past and future to offer the umpire a position from which to judge the forces fighting with each other with an impartial eye," end quote. But toward the end of this rich introduction, she seems to take another turn. These intervals cannot be applied to historical or biographical time. It is thinking, she writes, that opens up the access to the eternal, to what has infinite duration. It is neither a modern problem nor an historical phenomenon. So she's really speaking subspecies aeternitatis, as Kierkegaard would say. It is precisely this non-time space that cannot be inherited or passed down that comes to us as a Benjaminian ruin, vibrant and irrecoverable. It must be thought anew by each generation and indeed by each individual. And if this is what can be neither transmitted nor inherited, then it is also what is operative in resistance, as she herself has clearly said. Kafka is working with a tradition of reading and explicating in the Talmudic tradition, where stories and anecdotes are meant to illustrate the meaning of various prescriptions and maxims. And yet the idea that a story postdates the enunciation of a set of laws or maxims for conduct is called into question as it becomes clear, time and again, that the core meaning of a law cannot be disclosed through explication. The stories and parables that are traditionally supposed to offer instruction on how to live end up leading to impasse or to a strange sort of infinite sidebar. But as Benjamin puts it, the very relation between Agadah, the oral tradition of Jewish religion, and Halakha, the study of the law, is reversed. The story no longer illustrates the law, and it does not offer a pedagogical or allegorical way to live according to the law. On the contrary, the law, whose meaning can no longer be disclosed by the story or the parable, becomes an enigmatic force within fiction or within a dream. Thus, Agadah, the oral tradition from which many fragments in Kafka's writings are called, come to assume priority over Halakha, which means not only that we don't get much instruction on how to live, but that the problem of life becomes intertwined with the problem of fiction in new ways. In Benjamin's elliptical logic, the key to the law is lost, so the law no longer gives instruction on how to live. Life now, under these conditions, becomes an interminable process, another entry of infinity, an interminable process of trying to fathom the law, and the law becomes coextensive with a life interminably enigmatic. The story form, in fact, becomes the way to think about this living predicament of law. Now, it is this interminable commentary, this interminable interpretation, it could be used to simply confirm a traditional view of Kafka. Oh, Kafka's characters are wretched. They suffer a lot. They suffer from an endless despair that wears them down. But if unending commentary becomes the conduct of life, which means that allegory and parable in particular become bound up with life in ways that remain partially inscrutable, then we have another issue. The unending articulation of an enigma, which is the law, may not immediately sound messianic, but I want to suggest that this is pretty much how Sholem describes it. Further, the Jewish theological resonances clearly inflect the disfigurations of the human form that we find in Kafka and that drew Benjamin's attention. No human form can express the messianic. There are no saviors, and most of the characters who claim to have access to the law or who claim to represent the law prove to be engaged in spurious claims. Arendt clearly draws on the messianic streak in Kafka, or perhaps Benjamin's Kafka, I am not sure. And though she treats it lightly, it seems central to her idea of unauthorized action, of the wish for a judge or someone who could authorize the judge, a law that one could follow rather than the one that has to be collectively made. Kafka's relation to messianic ideas is well documented. He was exposed to certain Kabbalistic writings by the Czech poet Georg Langer, who had studied at Belz in Ukraine at what was called the Hasidic court of Rabbi Yisachar Dov Rocheach. It was Langer who told both Hasidic and Kabbalistic tales to Kafka. And there's lots that can be said about that in another context. But what I want to underscore here is that Arendt clearly knows that Benjamin's first text on Kafka, dated July 1934, was sent to Sholem, and that this opened an epistolary exchange between them on the relation between Kafka, law, and religion. Sholem finds in Kafka support for the point that the theological aspect of the world consists paradoxically in the non-appearance of God. As you may know, Sholem addressed God directly in a theological didactic poem, and he sent that poem to Kafka the same year. I'm sorry to say it's not a very good poem. Sholem writes there, to God, only your nothingness is the experience I am entitled to have of you. Sholem sought to argue that that nothingness signifies a withdrawal or absence of God, but surely not a refutation of God's existence. Withdrawn is historically what God is, or how he has to be. To say that God is withdrawn is still to say that God is something, even if God is precisely nowhere to be found. That is a negative illumination of God. Interestingly, Sholem declared explicitly, I would say that if we have to understand today the Kabbalah, first we must read the novels of Kafka, especially The Trial. In that same summer of 1934, you'd think they'd be writing about something other than Kafka, but no, it's Kafka. Sholem writes back to Benjamin, and for a reason, apparently. He writes back to Benjamin, Kafka's world, Sholem writes, Kafka's world is the world of revelation, but of revelation seen, of course, from that perspective in which it is returned to its own nothingness. The non-fulfillability of what has been revealed is the point where a correctly understood theology coincides most perfectly with that which offers the key to Kafka's work. So Sholem thinks that revelation can be expected to produce something knowable or phenomenal, and the revelation of God is not the same as the appearance of God within historical time in a knowable shape or form. No, that's not happening. And so what is revealed is not something, but rather nothing, but a determinate negation of a kind. But Sholem refuses to reject the idea of revelation fully. Arendt's own argument makes a stronger case against revelation, as did Benjamin, and her call for a departure from settled versions of human time, precisely to make something new or unprecedented, is an argument against revelation. In the place of revelation, there is the space of appearance. And that can only appear when people come together and bring something new into the world through word or deed. Benjamin's response to Sholem is to point out that parables no longer can tell us how to live. So when we study them, when we interpret them, it's not to find the clue to understanding what the law is or even what it asks of us, because the law is absent or never existed. What do? We tell stories, we produce commentaries, and those become precisely our conduct in life. The law is absent, yes, but that absence structures the parable and the story. And that process is interminable, importing a sense of infinity, which we might call a theological shadow of divine temporality, into storytelling and reading. Sholem objects to Benjamin's full inversion of the Jewish tradition, such that now the Agadah takes priority over the law, and the law is now the enigma about which the parable is formed, and its absence, the law's absence, is a primary and constant concern for Kafka's parables. Benjamin claims it's Kafka who has delinked Haggadah storytelling from halakha law, a move, by the way, that radicalizes the general impulse of the Jewish renewal movement at the time, which sought to displace the centrality of rabbinic authority in favor of a reawakening or a rebirth of spiritual Judaism. All right, I'm going to move to the end because I see that I've gone on too long, and I apologize, and you're hungry. Let me say this. It's interesting, of course, that Kafka departs from anthropocentrism, and we might say that Hannah Arendt goes back to it, and that's a struggle, and we can certainly talk about that. For Kafka, it's the dissolution of the human form and its centrality that allows whatever small hope there is to become possible, whatever refracted light there still can be from the source of life, what the Kabbalists call Ein Sof. This may well be the anxious hope that Susanna Gottlieb understands as the messianic in both Arendt and Auden. For Kafka, it's the animals, it's the non-human figures, it's the combinations of wood and animal and spirit that hold out some small hope. But for Arendt, the human remains central. There's a source of life, though, with its own space-time that emerges in thought, action, judgment, allied with natality, understood not only as making in the sense of giving birth, but as making new political forms in particular. The absence of law, the condition of no authority and no authorization, the problem of the Testament, is precisely the one in which humans gather to find between and among them a source of making that belongs to no one person and never can. The moment of revolution is one of radical lawmaking, and this form of creation is precisely counter to any thanatos, and is, at least at the outset, free of state violence and forms of legal coercion. She was always an opponent of the command structure of law and those positivist positions that claim that all law is backed by the force of the police or the army, such as the one espoused by the first John Austen. Arendt wished or dreamt of a polity that came together at the base of the mountain to give itself their own laws. The gift of the law does not come down from God, but it nevertheless enacts an eternal feature, even an infinitely inexhaustible one. In her view, if laws are freely made, they carry that freedom with them. And when they cease to be freely self-imposed, they lose their legitimacy. That freedom does not belong to rectilinear time, but constitutes its disruption. And this interruptive interval, if you like, is internal to freedom, to thinking, and to judging. Eichmann, you will remember, was fatally wrong because he failed to judge the law, failed to become a civil disobedient, joining with others to interrupt and bring down a racist, genocidal regime. There were many other intervals in which he could have done precisely that, but he refused to think and to judge and to act. In Arendt's world, laws are good to the degree that we judge them to be, and judgment dwells at an anarchic distance from all positive law. And because freedom emerges between us, and it's not the same as personal liberty or a freedom secured by state powers, freedom is free of all the political forms to which it gives rise. It belongs to another temporal order. The idea of plurality emerges from this idea of the interval between us from which freedom emerges, which is why she came to see in federalism a form of government that could preserve cultural specificity and historical formations of community without recourse to a centralized sovereign power. And finally, Arendt, as you know, praises the Federalist Papers throughout her writings on the US, and in these days, this would ally her with a pretty conservative political position. And in some ways, she was a conservative. Her writings on Little Rock showed in clear ways why it does not work to let communities discriminate against on racial grounds with whom to live and whose children may enter school or university with other children. Her view was that no one can be denied a place on the basis of race, but that communities had a right to their prejudices and that they could object to federal mandates to enforce integration. Her federalism gave priority to states' rights, and we see where that is leading us as the Supreme Court sacrifices its ethical and political obligations to states whose electors stoke and depend upon the reactionary passions of their constituencies. She imagined during the Second World War that the Jews could become a nation within Europe with their own army, and that was a federalist framework. And in Palestine, she thought that state sovereignty for the Jewish people was a major mistake, and that a binational state with relative autonomy for Jews and Palestinians would allow both peoples equally to cohabit that earth. That too is a federated model that continues to be debated and discussed. Each of these proposals are complex and debatable, and some may well constitute a deformation of her most idealistic views on plurality. But I think her opposition to state coercion, her thoroughgoing critique of totalitarianism, and her insistence that political power and freedom emerges from the interstices of every plurality suggests that she was trying to work out a politics freed from sovereign violence, affirming differences as the condition of freedom, where renewal and redemption come from an elsewhere that is also part of who we are. She was horrible on race. She was prescient about Palestine, and she was limited in her ability to find in Marx whatever every society requires to live. The criticism will and should continue, but perhaps there's something important here in finding an inexhaustible source in a freedom that relies on our social bond to emerge. She does not use the word collective, but perhaps this is a view of collective freedom, of covenant, of renewal, that we might consider in light of all that has been lost and all that is undergoing destruction during this time. Thank you for your patience. Why don't we just take two or three questions, and I'll try to be brief.
This was so rich and wonderful to take some time to absorb and digest the various moves you take us. When we talk about the gap, the interval, then you mentioned cracks in time, moments in time in which something may or can emerge. Talk about interruption, and you began with the Nesha, so with a certain historical moment. So I wonder, to what extent do you think that the kind of thinking she develops in this introduction between past and future, in reference to Sharp, is historical or time related, i.e., post the catastrophe, after the catastrophe, maybe a way to think about modernity, or alternatively, something timeless, something we as humans have always faced, those moments of interruption, the gap, the breaks, the cracks, which allow what she calls insertion to become real. Should we historicize, or should we think, philosophically?
Both. But I think she is saying something about how, if you're a rigorous historian, that is to say, you want to see how every act emerges from some condition or from some precedent, or you want your causal, or you want a clear narrative that gives you a step-by-step explanation. If you're trying to, explain transition, like the dissolution of one regime and the emergence of another, there will be a way in which your explanation cannot fully work because it cannot account for something that is not part of a sequence, right? There's something that is an interval that breaks the sequence, and that is precisely the significance of the upsurge of freedom, or the dynamism of resistance, or even the event of revolution. So, what gets opened by the interval is another temporality, and and if what is happening there is freedom, it is an inexhaustible source, and it doesn't belong to us as humans. It is between us, interestingly enough, and it only emerges in that relation in that interval between us. So the interval is both the break with linear time, but it's also the interval that establishes us as a plurality, which is why we also don't blend into each other. There's a form of generative differentiation there that I think is really crucial to her understanding. So yes, we have to do that historical work, and she's done it, and she's given us histories of totalitarianism. It's not an argument against history. It's just telling us what the limits of an historical explanation can be, because what Shar is lamenting, even as he's living it, is something that will not be documented. There's no authorization for it, and there's no document that will be able to pass it along. So that how do we think about that the non-transmissibility of that moment? It doesn't work through a linear time or the linearity that is presupposed by, say, testaments or transmission. I mean, I think it's super theological, quite frankly, right? For this nice secular Jewish girl.
Thank you. So I was fascinated by what you said about hope residing for Kafka in the non-human, and Arendt sort of turning back to humanism and thinking about this, we are in the humanities center, right? And yet the trend in the humanities, particularly within academia, is towards forms of sort of post-humanism and sort of post-centrism, thank you. And thinking about the sort of forms of collectivity that are possible, that are enabled by thinking with Arendt. To what extent does the human remain a necessary category for these forms of collectivity and for the sort of relating to one another? Or should we be stepping away from the human and sort of embracing a broader collectivity?
Well, that's probably too big for me to answer. But let's be careful. It's true that she returns to the problem of the human, but she's also really clear that the human is part of an ever-changing, regenerative biological cycle. So she's accepting that there's a context of transient and regenerative living processes in which the human has to be situated. She's also, I don't know if we want to call it a humanism, we might, but humanism has a history, and sometimes when people say post-human, like which version of the human are we post? like the human has gone through quite a change in the Arendtian formulation, right? I mean, the critique of personal liberty, although of course she would defend personal liberties and did do that, but the idea that freedom is more than personal liberty, that it actually has this relational character and generative character, and then it might even be related back to a kind of inexhaustible life source. All of this kind of resituates the human in some ways that we need to take account of before we can decide whether or not we're post-human. And I sometimes just think some of these arguments are just too quick. Like I'm not totally convinced. I think that Kafka works quite brilliantly with the, as does Benjamin in a different way, with the prohibition against giving some kind of human form to God, or giving a picture of God. The divine is always going to be arriving obliquely and in a fragmentary way. And I think there are debates about how well Sholem and Kafka and Benjamin really knew their Kabbalah. I mean, but there was something in their reception of it that gave them a way of thinking the messianic against the human form, which doesn't mean they were against humans. They were just saying the human form can't actually adequately represent and ought not to. And Kafka's Messianic Animals is a different paper. So I can't go there. Can we just take one more?
Thank you. There were a lot of things in that paper that were slow and were helpful because they were slow. And one of the things in the paper that was less slow and therefore less helpful for me was Arendt as a critic of revelation. Or Arendt departing from revelation. And I want to just make a suggestion that some of what seems to come out of the rhythm of transience sounds a lot more like revelation than any other theological category.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if Arendt is taking us back to anthropocentrism. And simply the provocation is the rhythm of transience in the gap or the interstice of the not, or we're not calling it present, but like between, in the between. From this standpoint, from the standpoint of the gap, the eternal transience seems like a reminder from the perspective of the gap that we are created.
Uh-huh.
And if we are created and considering it from the standpoint of this gap, that seems like an upsurge of freedom, but the upsurge of freedom is a symptom of a kind of what Arendt would call miraculous, but a miraculous revelation in the gap.
Okay.
If the standpoint of understanding that we are created from this gap is all that distinguishes creation, which is the standpoint of the past and the present, then I would suggest that's much more revelation than it is messianic. And I would say one additional thing, which is if Arendt is reclaiming the human a little bit from Benjamin and Kafka, then she is in some sense reclaiming a more rationalist Jewish theology from the mysticism of Benjamin and Kafka, and show them even as she's getting some of what she's getting from them for sure. So I was curious, maybe we'll linger a little longer with why it's not revelation or something like that.
No, I mean, I would make a longer argument about where Hermann Cohen comes in her Kantianism and where Sholem and Benjamin come in her in her understanding of freedom and judgment and the like. So I think that there are several strains, and of course, you know, this would also involve me in an account of influence, or that, you know, that would be hard to do, but I would be willing to do it. But let me just say this to you. What she is against, and maybe I need to make this more precise, is the idea that the divine reveals itself in time, over time. So against, I think, an eschatological scheme or something like that. Now, it may be that we could still call it revelation, as you suggest, if we say that's correct, that there's not a slower, inevitable revelation of the divine in time. It doesn't appear in history. It doesn't make itself known in history. We're not waiting for the time in which the divine appears and announces itself as such. Well, I don't know. Maybe we're waiting. We're probably still waiting. But, you know, it doesn't matter whether we're waiting. Okay. But the point being that whatever there is of the divine is there as an internal feature of the interval that opens up the possibility of freedom, that opens up the possibility of action and judgment, very standard political and philosophical categories, and makes it impossible to fully historicize them, right? Like, what is the non-historicizable element of these, of freedom, of action, of judgment, of resistance, of revolution? And okay, but maybe what you're telling me is that, you know, maybe the upsurge is the revelatory moment, right? And it's not teleological and it's not eschatological, which just means that I have to hold back. I was interested in contrasting the idea of revelation that Sholem holds on to in his interesting and odd way to the idea of the space of appearance. Because she does, it's not that we act, I mean, yes, we need a public space in which to act. And if there are no public spaces, then we're angry and we call for public space. The entire Gezi Park resistance in Turkey was about demanding public space, right? at the same time, when we do act in a concerted way, a space of appearance is created through that action. And what is that space? What is that form of appearance? And I think that contrasts in an interesting way with more traditional ideas of revelation. But if I'm to take your suggestion, maybe I need to rethink the temporality of revelation. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you very much.